Welcome, listeners, to the latest episode of Out of Left Field. We are a podcast broadcasting from the Gulag Archipelago of Soviet Kazakhstan, otherwise known as beautiful Victoria, British Columbia. This episode, we're going to be talking with Cory Doctorow about an interesting new development going on in Toronto. Is it Delta City? Is it Cypress Creek? You decide. We're going to be talking about it. Of course, as per usual, I'm Mac, your co-host.
And I am Ben, your co-host and producer.
I'm Anthony, also a co-host.
Thank you for tuning in, everyone. This is our interview with author, blogger, and all-around cool dude,
Sci-fi enthusiast.
Sci-fi enthusiast and dystopian cyberpunk writer, Cory Doctorow. All right, so let's get started. So, Cory Doctorow, thank you so much for being back on the podcast. So you published an article on your blog, boingboing.net, titled Leaked Document Reveals that Sidewalk Labs Toronto Plans for Private Taxation, Private Roads, Charter Schools, Corporate Cops, and Judges, and Punishment for People Who Choose Privacy. So we're going to be spending the next little while talking about this Sidewalk Labs development in Toronto that has a metric shit ton of money behind it, as is very obvious from their website and their YouTube page. So first of all, can you just...
I think you'll find that as an American company, they have an imperial shit ton.
Okay, touche. Yeah. So can you just bring everybody up to speed on who are Sidewalk Labs, what's their relationship to Google's parent company Alphabet, and what are their plans to develop Toronto's eastern waterfront?
Yeah, I think it's useful to just have a little perspective on Alphabet, as you say, and Google, and its historic context, because it's really relevant to the sums of money that are available to the firm and so on. So historically in the US, it was illegal for companies to grow by acquiring nascent competitors or merging with major competitors or by cornering vertical markets. But starting in the Reagan era, the radical theories of a guy named Robert Bork came into vogue. And Bork said that there was no reason to enforce antitrust law unless a company was likely to raise prices in the short term after doing so. And so this kicked off decades of mergers and acquisitions and market concentration. And each time that happened, the newer, bigger firms were able to lobby for even more extreme versions of this. There's even an organization funded by giant corporations called the Mercatus Institute that runs annual summer retreats for judges. And they've flown a really significant fraction of U.S. federal judges to Florida for these kind of retreats where they're given continuing education in the form of these arguments for monopoly and against antitrust enforcement. And so it's against that backdrop that you really need to understand Google, because Google is not a company that grew by inventing a bunch of cool stuff. Google is a company that grew by buying other companies, by merging with other companies. You know, Google has invented 1.5 successful products, right? They made a search engine that was really good, and they made a very, very good Hotmail clone. And everything else they've done that's successful is something that they bought, and everything else that they've done internally without buying it has generally been not much of a success. And so that's kind of the Google story. And as part of that, Google's upper management decided that they would try and not really silo the companies, but kind of spin them out each into their own little fiefdom, because there are definitely some diseconomies of scale when a company gets that big. You can see that with Yahoo, right? Yahoo bought a Canadian company from Vancouver called Ludacorp that made a product called Flickr that was the first product to do photos for mobile devices. And you'd think that would be kind of a license to print money as mobile phones were taking off. But Yahoo had also bought a bunch of other companies that did related things. And the various executives that oversaw those other companies kind of systematically sabotaged Flickr. And so Flickr today is a ghost of what it could have been, and Yahoo sold it off for a fraction of what they paid for it. And that's a story that redounds all the way through the Yahoo story. So kind of in a bid to get very, very big without experiencing what Brandeis called the curse of bigness, Google created this weird corporate structure where they made a new company called Alphabet, and then they sold Google to Alphabet. And then they took a bunch of divisions of Google and they made them their own companies, and then they sold those to Alphabet too. And so you have Alphabet that's kind of a parent company, and then you have all these other companies that sit underneath it. And in theory, they're all independent companies with the same owner. In practice, that turns out to be mostly kind of a legal fiction. Companies like Nest, which make home surveillance and automation systems, were originally part of Google, then part of Alphabet, and then part of Google. And really all that's happening is like someone is dragging rectangles around on an org chart. But in terms of like this legal fiction, you have this idea that you have this independent company that the next day isn't independent, and then the day after it is. It's a bit like Trump, valuing his properties, where, when he's paying taxes on them, he drags some boxes around and says they're worth nothing. And then when he's using them as collateral, he drags the boxes back and says they're worth, ungodly fortunes and gets giant loans on them. In the same way, Google is able to do this kind of financial, institutional shenanigan. And Sidewalk Labs, it's one of those companies that Google tried to start internally. It has yet to do anything real. It's had a lot of talk behind it, and it's technically not part of Google. It's part of Alphabet. But there's no reason to believe that it wouldn't be part of Google again, like tomorrow, if it made, accounting sense to make it part of Google. And then the day after, it might be an independent company again. It's this independence is really a fiction. So Sidewalk Labs' mandate is to build smart cities. And smart city is one of those kind of nebulous marketing hype terms that doesn't have a crisp definition, but it's some version of a city that uses sensors and actuators to understand what's going on in it from moment to moment, to analyze what's going on, and to respond to it in some way. And, cities are already smart in that sense, right? Like, the police have a sensor called the 911 system, and they have an actuator called a police car. And when you call 911 and say, someone's doing a horrible murder on my street, the police actuate the robot, the police car, which whisks them at, 150 kilometers an hour down the road to your house, right? So that's already happening. It's just like more of it. And there's not really anything about a smart city that says that it has to be run or managed by private firms. It could just as easily be in public management. And because the definition is so broad, it's like very hard to say, when someone says, oh, we're going to make your city a smart city, what it is. Now, in terms of this revelation, it's the latest in a series of leaks from Sidewalk Labs. Sidewalk Labs did deals with the former city government of Toronto and the province of Ontario to build a kind of pilot city in the middle of Toronto. They're gonna take a bit of disused lakeshore property, and Toronto's lakeshore, for people who aren't from the city, is a weird beast, because lakeshore property is historically very valuable property in cities, but because of an ill-advised elevated highway that runs down most of the lakeshore, the lakeshore has been cut off from the rest of the city. And so the lakeshore lands were largely blighted for a long time and have been very slow to develop. My grandfather ran a scrapyard on lakeshore land when he came to Canada. He was, sort of a poor refugee from Poland who built a scrapyard out by Cherry Beach. And eventually had it expropriated by the city as part of a redevelopment program, whereupon the city discovered that they had been illegally dumping PCBs in my grandfather's scrapyard all that time. And, it's probably why he died of the horrible cancer that he died of. And they had been hiding it from him, so he didn't even know that they'd been doing it. So these are kind of weird, blighted lands that represent a real opportunity in a city with a giant housing crisis and a real estate bubble. And so Google got permission, or Sidewalk Labs got permission, to build a small a small kind of pilot project, related in some ways to the charter city movement, where there's a lot of people on the libertarian right and in the rationalist movement, and some on the left even, who've talked about building cities that are exempt from municipal or provincial or federal regulation, and that would have a charter, like a charter school, that would allow it to do something experimental just to see if it would work, right? And people could move there or not move there if they wanted. It kind of grows out of the special economic zones that created tax havens and other kinds of weird financial institutions or financial artifacts, free ports. There's a free port outside of Geneva full of shipping containers that are full of precious works of art. And these precious works of art are exempt from taxation so long as they never leave the free port. And so when people sell them, again, they just like drag boxes around on a spreadsheet. It's that no one ever looks at this art or gets it out of the box. It just moves around on a spreadsheet, who owns which crate in which container. So it's something like that, right? Building this kind of like weird autonomous zone or semi-autonomous zone. And last year or earlier this year, we published an article on Boing Boing by an independent researcher and journalist called Rosemary Fry, or Frey. I'm not sure how she says her name because we correspond by email. And Rosemary had read through the memo of understanding between Sidewalk Labs and the City of Toronto with a very fine eye. And it's one of these like obfuscated, sprawling garbage novellas of legalese that are very hard to make sense of. But she figured out that they had either with the collusion of the City of Toronto or by fooling the City of Toronto, they had secured permission not to build this tiny little pilot over a couple of neighborhoods, but actually it gave them permission to build across the entire lakeshore, to take over really most of downtown Toronto and turn it into this weird surveillance city, this privatized surveillance city. And we published it. Some PR flacks from Sidewalk got in touch with me and told me that I was wrong, I was mistaken. We followed it up. The Globe and Mail picked it up. They admitted that they'd done it. And so that was kind of the first leak or breach. There were a series of like little breaches that came about as a result of the plans that Sidewalk was developing. So they had recruited a kind of all-star privacy advisory board with people on it like Anne Kavukian, who'd been the Ontario Privacy Commissioner and is the sister of the beloved children's entertainer Rafi Kavukian, which is super cool. It's my favorite fact about privacy, that one of Canada's best privacy campaigners is the sister of Rafi, the beloved children's singer. And all these other kind of great people who were just one after another just quit. And sent these letters of resignation, sometimes public, sometimes private, but then they leaked, just saying like, you guys are not doing what you said you would. This is going to be gross and terrible. It's a dumpster fire. I'm leaving. And then came the latest leak, the one that we're talking about, which was the leak of the Yellow Book. And so the Yellow Book was the original kind of vision book for Sidewalk Labs, where they had written out exactly what they thought they could do with Sidewalk Labs, how they convinced, Google upper management to create this division and fund it, and how they lured, because of the way Google is structured, engineers have a lot of autonomy. They choose what project they want to work on. So you kind of got to make a little scissor reel if you want to get engineers to leave the teams they're on and come to your team. So this Yellow Book represented all of that. And the Yellow Book laid out a plan that was much more ambitious than anything we've seen in the kind of overt descriptions from Sidewalk. And the Yellow Book made reference to a thing called the Reedy Creek Improvement District, which is the area in Central Florida where Disney World is located. And when Walt was planning to build Disney World, it represented an effort not just to kind of go bigger than Disneyland, which had opened in 1955. But by the mid-60s, Walt was really chafing at some of the strictures of being regulated by the city of Anaheim and the county of Orange County and the state of California. And he wanted more autonomy. He wanted to write his own building codes. He wanted to come up with his own statutes. He even wanted to be able to build a nuclear power plant if he wanted.
Jesus
and so
Christ.
If he wanted, all right? I mean, he will.
If he wanted, right. Yeah, because this was like, you have to remember in 64, Disney did the World's Fair exhibits, and one of them was for GE, the Carousel of Progress and Progress Land, the city that was the kind of model of a dome city that was adjacent to it that you exited through. And Progress Land included a GE nuclear power plant, and Walt was quite enamored of this. And so he did a deal with the state of Florida to build a kind of special economic zone, what's called the Reedy Creek Improvement District, that encompasses a city called Lake Buena Vista. So they're roughly the same plot of land. And so between the fact that everyone who lives in the city is a Disney employee, right? Disney is like the only resident of this city. So they elect the council, they write their own ordinances. And then the Reedy Creek Improvement District that had this special legal status as an improvement district. Disney now has this enormous latitude about how they conduct themselves in terms of environmental regulation, public safety, building codes, and so on. And, to be fair to them, like I'm a reasonably sharp Disney critic, although I like the theme parks. That's kind of one of the things I write about, which is how I know so much about this stuff. They've been not terrible stewards of Reedy Creek, in terms of environmental stewardship and so on. But it is this plot of land twice the size of Manhattan in Central Florida that's not just privately owned, but privately governed. And that is what's in the plan for in the Yellow Book. They say, like, we should find a sucker, basically, cue Rob Ford, crack pipe in hand, right? We should find a sucker who will let us build a Reedy Creek Improvement District inside their city limits. And they identify a bunch of other cities, and it's a kind of disaster porn tour of the region, right? So the other big one that they're looking at is Detroit. And of course, this is at a moment when Detroit was really on its knees, the financial crisis and foreclosure crisis and, austerity and food deserts and, houses being torn down after they become blighted, and the fire department being so starved of budget that when arsonists set fire, they couldn't afford it. And here comes Disney going, like, we should take this historically African-American city that's been blighted and destroyed by the financial sector, and we should, like, now that it's on its knees, we should get them to let us, like, run it as an experimental laboratory. And so now it stops looking like a charter city, right? Because the people in Detroit, well, some of them are there because they love it, and they should, because it's an amazing city and resilient and incredible. But there is a substantial fraction of the population of Detroit who are there because they can't leave. So if you turn Detroit into a charter city, it's not like, hey, we're building this cool experimental like prototype over here. Who wants to come and experience what things might be like in the future and help us learn? It's more like, you wake up one morning and it's a cross between Blade Runner and Kafka, and run by a bunch of people who like are sitting thousands of miles away in Silicon Valley, drinking barista coffee, getting chair massages, and counting their stock options. And so that's the kind of the context here. And the Yellow Book lays out a very ambitious plan. Private schools, charter schools, privatized police force. They compare it to the police forces on American and to a lesser extent Canadian university campuses who, they have power to enforce civil law. They have maybe the power to detain people until the police can come and arrest them. Kind of like mall cops plus. They also then set out a bunch of services that would be available in the event that you were willing to share your data with the city, right? So if, for example, if you forwent cash and only used Google issued digital payment systems, which would allow them to gather data on all of your payment and usage and so on, then there might be things offered to you. Like it might be easier to get a taxi, or it might be possible at all to get a taxi. Maybe all the taxis take some form of digital cash like Uber does, and none of them will accept cash money. So what they pose this as is as a benefit, but really what it is it's a punishment. Right? They're taking a thing that already exists that you can already do, and they're taking it away from you. And they're saying you can only have it back if you agree to conduct your affairs to maximize benefit to our shareholders. And that's pretty clearly not a benefit, right? It's pretty clearly a punishment for non-compliance. And so that kind of brings us up to the present day. The Yellow Book comes out the day before the final or the most recent meeting with Waterfront Toronto, which is this kind of quasi-governmental organization that is the institution to whom Sidewalk Labs must answer if they want to be permitted to go on building out. And so this gets leaked and published by the Globe. Sidewalk says, yes, that was our aspirational document. It's not what's in our detailed plan now. By the way, we amended those things that we thought we would do, that would give us permission to like take over the whole waterfront. We amended that. We're back to our original zone, and it'll all be fine, guys. And Waterfront Toronto, they greenlight them. So now they're moving on to the next phase. It's not the final phase, and there might be opportunities in future to dial it back or to even kill it. But for now, it's full speed ahead.
Oops, we said the quiet part out loud.
I love that. It's that's not what we're going to do. That's merely what we want to do.
Put the genie back in the bottle, you guys.
One thing I do want to just mention before we go any further is Detroit. This is Delta City. This is the OCP shit from RoboCop. This is the gleaming city of glass and steel that will do away with the old world, and everyone will live in like work pods, and no one will have to worry about it, and we can do away with democracy, which has failed the people.
Yeah, well, it's not a coincidence that the people who kind of advocate for this, a kind of right-wing libertarian / rationalist movement, are very skeptical of democracy. You have people like Peter Thiel saying democracy is incompatible with freedom. By freedom, he means the freedom to amass arbitrarily large fortunes. And he says, well, if only a small number of people amass arbitrarily large fortunes, then by definition, most people won't have those fortunes. And if you give those people the vote, they might take some of those fortunes away. And so therefore, freedom cannot be reconciled with democracy. And Thiel, of course, he's a charter city guy. He wants to build, he's an investor in seasteading, which is floating charter cities.
Genius.
Cory, when I read the description,
Waterworld.
When I read the description of the Sidewalk Labs proposal for the development of Toronto, it's as though they were deliberately imitating one of the cyberpunk dystopias that like you write about in your novels and stuff. It's like they were trying to do it on purpose. So the Toronto City Council has green-lighted the development, albeit with nuanced privacy concerns. However, as everybody knows, Google and Facebook and all these big tech companies constantly behave like they're above the law. And Google, again, as everyone knows, makes their money off of collecting, personal information and advertising and whatnot. So do you think this whole the urban data trust that Sidewalk Labs has said that they're going to be super responsible with everyone's data, is this a fig leaf? Do you have any faith whatsoever in these assurances?
Well, I mean, I guess there's two ways to evaluate that, because it's hard to predict what will happen in the future. So one of them is one heuristic that you suggested, and it's not an unreasonable one, is like, how do they would it be good for them to break this promise? And it seems pretty clear it would be. I'm one of those people who thinks that by and large, big techs, the way that they tout the value of the data is like grossly overstated. That that they claim that they can make you believe up is down and white is black if they just have enough data, and when you actually see what they do, it's pretty crude. And when you look at how they command really high ad prices, mostly it seems to be through monopolization and not because they have a better tool than anyone else. They just have the only tool, right? They've just managed to monopolize big chunks of the internet and search and so on. But that doesn't mean they don't believe that they can extract tons of value from data. They certainly act like they can. And, in the same way that like hedge funds are universally run by hedge fund managers who think that they can beat the market, and hedge funds just don't beat the market. The big data firms are filled with people who believe that big data will let them find, the latent truth of the universe. And the fact that they never find it to them is just evidence that they need to collect more data.
There's someone out there who needs to buy a tin of cat food, and if only we knew who that person was and could VoIP a tin of cat food to them, we'd be making so much money.
Well, the old saying, right? Like when you find yourself at the bottom of a hole, stop digging. The big tech version of this is when you find yourself at the bottom of the hole, it means you're not digging hard enough. So that's kind of one heuristic. It's not outrageous to think that like if they've done it before, they might do it again. That after all is the entire basis of machine learning, right? You the last time you typed hey, you finished it with darling. So every time you type hey from now on, your phone is going to try and autocomplete it with darling because it thinks that you're texting your partner and not, the babysitter. And so, that's that. I mean, I think that's reasonably plausible. I think other heuristics that we can use to evaluate the kind of sincerity of their plan are how they have interacted with the people they brought on board to safeguard privacy. And they've ignored them, right? They sidelined them. They made them have so little confidence in the process that they all quit. And so that's probably also a pretty good kind of early sign of what we can expect from them. And it wasn't just on privacy. There was a a great, well, not great, a really disturbing set of revelations from some First Nations elders who were part of a consultation, because, you know, it's on unceded land, unceded First Nations land. And they were involved in a consultation about how Sidewalk Labs could be respectful of First Nations and the need for truth and reconciliation and so on. And they ignored every one of their recommendations and then filled their consultation documents with references to how extensively they consulted with Indigenous people.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
And you know,
So
it's,
they lied.
That
They lied. They just lied about
well,
it.
no, they did consult extensively with Indigenous people. They just ignored everything they said. Right? It's a lie of omission.
Oh, fair enough. I suppose Google
you know,
Dictionary would prove them right on that one, I suppose.
Yeah, and you know, in the same way they can say that we assembled an all-star privacy team, and if they don't mention they all walked off because they lost confidence in our project, it sounds pretty good. And then finally you can look at like the actual lies, right? The lies about the scope of the city, the lies about you know, other elements of it where they have not been forthright. And, you know, again, like things change, right? People change, firms' conduct, you know, past performance is not necessarily a predictor of the future, but it's not a terrible predictor of the future. Like, as a rule of thumb, a thing that a firm has done habitually is likely to be the thing that it does in the future in the absence of some profound change. That's a good rule of thumb. And so if we trust them to keep the data on shore, if we trust them to manage it in accord with Canadian privacy rules, I think that trust would be, you know, if not misplaced, at least extremely optimistic. You know, and actually, I think it is misplaced. I think that, you know, fool me once, shame on you, as George W. Bush says, fool me twice, we don't get fooled again.
So I'd actually like to kind of push that insight that you just shared a little bit, basically that what corporations have done in the past are generally a pretty reliable bar for what they're going to do in the future, and, you know, talk about the kind of dystopian horror of this modular city concept for Sidewalk Labs that we're hearing about. So, I mean, in Google, as you just said about, you know, how Sidewalk can kind of convene panels of privacy experts or Indigenous consultation teams, and as long as you're assembling the data point, it's fine. You can then liquidate it, not make any use of it, but you could show it's there. Also reminiscent of their kind of overall company structure, where they can kind of like aggregate themselves and disaggregate themselves into different pockets of businesses and liquefy assets as needs be. So how do we read all of this kind of company organization across this terrifying modular city concept? And what I mean by that is, so I was watching one of these Sidewalk videos, and they're talking about literally building massive kind of modular block towers that can be turned from parking into housing, into small businesses, into whatever. And they're presenting this as, you know, really conducive to whatever the current needs of the city and the community are going to be. But to me, it just reads like, wow, it's going to be real goddamn easy to gentrify whomever you need to at any given moment by, oh, this is no longer housing, it's small shops.
We need parking lots where you live, so piss off.
Yeah. So what are the futures of this kind of like weird modularity look like in the smart cities that Sidewalk is proposing? And what should we think about that across, like, you know, settler colonialism and homelessness crisis as well?
Yeah, so let me push back very gently and say that while it's important to think about what technology does, it's a lot more important to think about who it does it for and who it does it to, right? You know, the characters of neighborhoods do change, right? I live in Burbank, California now, and I've been involved in our local city politics lately because there's a statewide rent control rule going in on Jan 1, but it only affects sitting tenants. And Burbank's one of the few cities in the region that has no fault evictions. And so we've had this wave of evictions where landlords are kicking people out timed for Christmas week so that they can start the new year with no tenants and avoid their rent controls. And so I've been, that's just kind of neither here nor there, but I've been down at City Hall a lot speaking on the need for a local rent control ordinance and hearing what all the other people are showing up for. And one of the kind of running battles in my city that I never knew about is the local Armenian community are furious with the Burbank Historical Preservation Society because by their lights anyways, the Burbank Historical Preservation Society is filled with racist white people who don't like Armenians and use historical preservation as a reason to ban people from adding extensions to their house to accommodate larger families that are typical of Armenians, right? And so when people move in who have different demographics, when neighborhoods become empty nest, when, whatever, like being able to reconfigure your housing stock or your retail stock, that's like not in and of itself a bad idea. But as you say, when the people on the ground don't get a look in, right, when they don't get to express their preferences, then you are reliant on the benignness of a dictator, right? You're reliant on a technocrat, an unaccountable technocrat at a firm that you have no insight into and no say over, making a decision that is optimal for you. So if we had a responsive municipal government, imagine if Toronto hadn't been gerrymandered by Mike Harris and still had control over its city hall, and it had a bunch of modular reconfigurable housing stock, we could do a bunch of stuff to alleviate the extremely dangerous housing crisis that is really undermined the quality of life in the city. If it were under democratic control, right? If it were under the control of a responsive, legitimate democratic government. It's hard to imagine that a for-profit corporation will ever be as democratic as the city. And, the way that their answer to this, I think, to kind of put if I were running Sidewalk Labs, and hilariously, the guy running Sidewalk Labs is a guy named Dan Doctorow. My last name is Doctorow.
So he's like
Those
your evil,
are both,
your true nemesis.
Yeah. Yeah, they're both Anglicizations of a Russian named Doktorovich. And so... we have the same last name, me and this guy. So to take off my Doctorow hat and put on my Doctorow hat, if I were he, I would say something like, we will have an enormous amount of data that will allow us to figure out what should be done with each block by block, that to make it optimal. And the right answer to that, the reason that is not a good rebuttal, is that there is no empirical right answer for what to do with city blocks based on data. What city blocks can do is tell you, based on your priorities, how to enact those priorities. But what it can't do is tell you what your priorities should be. So if I can give you an example, in the UK where I used to live, we had this amazing drug czar. This guy was in charge of drugs policy named David Nutt, who's a psychopharmacologist. And he was charged with top to bottom rescheduling of controlled substances, of recreational drugs, and to figure out which ones would be prohibited under all circumstances and which ones would have medical uses and so on and so on. So he convened an expert panel and he said, I want you to tell me drug by drug how dangerous this is to the user of the drug, the family of the user of the drug, and the wider society. I want you to make these rankings. And then he used some statistical modeling to figure out which drugs rankings changed based on which of those things you prioritized and which ones had stable rankings no matter what you prioritized, right? If a drug is very benign, it's going to be very benign no matter whether you prioritize harm to users or families or society. But some drugs are much more harmful to users than their families or what have you. Then he went to Parliament and he said, okay, I have objective rankings for the various dangers represented by different drugs. Now I need your subjective political choice about which of those harms we value the most and which ones we're least concerned about. And then you don't get to tell me where the drugs sit in the schedule because I have the data. I will tell you where in the schedule the drugs sit, but you have to tell me what your priorities are so that I can apply the data. And, Google may be right. Doctorow may be right if he says, we can give you the data to inform your policy choices. But that's not really the promise of Google and Sidewalk Labs. The promise is we can tell you what your policy priorities should be, and then use the data to enact them. And that is a profoundly undemocratic decision that does make this kind of reconfigurable building and so on, that makes them into recipes for gentrification and other evils.
Well, I mean, we have enough problems with just the private ownership of land and development of, shitty landlords and vulture-like property developers that just want to build stuff for a short-term profit, as is, let alone selling off an entire part of the city to one of the world's largest for-profit corporations, for Christ's sake. So I can't imagine that they would be any more responsible than our current, vulture landlords that we have anyway, even in a supposedly democratic space.
Yeah, I mean, there's a pretty compelling argument that people on both the left and the right have embraced about some of the weird things that happens when you enact rent controls as a way of solving housing crises, that it does change the way that developers invest in property. But all of those problems with rent control are offset in anyone's model with public housing. Right? Like, there is a way for cities, if they can't convince developers to build property, to get to build housing, to get housing within their city limits, and that's just to build it, right? And to do that, cities need places to build on. So as you say, I think that does exacerbate it. And I think that the Google and Sidewalk Labs will probably be a better landlord than, say, the Sahotas, right? And in general, I think Google and companies and the other big tech companies, because they're not fly by night, right? Because they've got a lot to lose. They tend to screw up in different ways from the smaller firms, because they have a kind of risk-averse culture these days. So if you think about a company like Ashley Madison, which is a Canadian, made in Canada story, right? They were basically a giant Potemkin village, right? They were full of bots pretending to be women that were used to kind of tempt men into spending more money messaging on the service. There were almost no women on the service at all. And they also had really, really bad data handling and data protection practices. So eventually the names of every man who was trying to cheat on his partner leaked. And that's kind of breach is actually much more characteristic of the smaller fly-by-night companies than the big ones. But the big ones do make giant mistakes, and when they do, they're rarer, but when they do, they have a much broader effect because they have a much bigger footprint, right? When Mark Zuckerberg makes a dumb decision, it redounds to 2.5 billion Facebook users. When the owners of Ashley Madison make dumb decisions, it's just a couple of million people who get affected. And so, I if I had to choose between the smart city in Toronto being built by Google and being built by like some nameless startup using white label, surveillance devices from Shenzhen and Guangzhou, I would probably prefer Google. But if I really had to choose, I would probably prefer that like a democratic and accountable city do whatever kind of instrumentation and actuating is needed to make it as good as possible.
Well, the Ashley Madison example is actually pretty hilarious and pretty telling, I think, of how a lot of these, mass data collecting companies are actually making their money, which is more or less by producing this massive desire and then kind of filling it. But it's just a void, a black hole at the end. You log into Facebook or Google, it's just bombarding you with targeted ads. And that's, your patterns of consumption are basically how you're producing the relevant data points for them, which they can then use to generate advertising revenue, this, that, and the other thing. So is the story of, being a corporate serf to Sidewalk Labs and Google, or, having Sidewalk be my landlord, gonna be like an exchange where I have to have, a scrolling marquee digital billboard in my living room and instead of a TV or something? I mean, can you speak to some of the privacy concerns and then how advertising ties into this in relation to the models of profitability that we see in these cities and the very real privacy concerns that have been brought up in Toronto Council?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you've actually done a pretty good job of sketching out the privacy concerns, right? From targeted advertising to data breaches to abuse of that data by some subsequent government. You know, the number of times people have gathered data for notionally benign purposes, but then there's a change in government or a change in ownership, and that data is used in ways that are harmful to the people on whom it was collected. I mean, the most canonical example are the Dutch and Danish governments that collected demographics so they could help new migrant populations settle into their countries. And that demographic data was the first thing the Nazis seized when they marched into their capitals and used it to figure out who to round up. So, you know, that's a pretty extreme example, and Godwin's law is like an iron law of internet discourse. So it doesn't have to be Nazis that do it, but there are plenty of times that this kind of data has been repurposed for in ways that harm the people who were promised that it would benefit them. But what I really want to talk about is like whether or not it's possible to imagine a smart city that isn't creepy in this way, a smart city that is oriented around people rather than firms. That's a kind of Jane Jacobs-y kind of smart city. Because, you know, I don't know about you, but many is the time that a crowded streetcar has gone by and I've thought, gosh, if I knew I was going to have to wait for 3 streetcars, I'd have taken my bicycle or maybe a cab, or where I've wished that I knew, you know, rather than getting the Dufferin bus, I should get the King car or whatever. There are lots of times where information about the city from moment to moment, and even long-term information about the city, about plans and things coming up, would have been really useful to have in my life and made my life as a resident of a city better. And I have a model for this called treating peoples as sensors and not treating them as things to be sensed. So the pool of all the information about a city or about the parts of the city that you're interacting with, it's not very large, right? Like the number, all the cars on the roads and all the buses and all the public transit and all the addresses and where the public toilets are and whether they're in service or out of service and, you know, where the nearest medical clinic is and whatever. It's just not that much data. And there's no reason why that data couldn't be kind of continuously streamed to you and your devices, instead of your devices handing all of your information to a central server that decides which subset of that data to show you. All of that data could be sent to you the same way that if you're familiar with how networks work, all of the packets for all of the computers on a network are sent to every computer, and computers pluck out the ones that have their address on them and throw away the rest of them. This is how, you know, Ethernet sniffing works. And so all of this data would just be there. It'd be there for you to grab. And then your device, which belongs to you and is responsive to you and doesn't give your data to anyone else, would know a lot about you because it's intimately connected with you, and it would know maybe even things as intimate as, you know, your blood sugar or when the last time you peed was. And it would sort through all that information and order it for you. If it seemed like you might be getting hungry because you usually eat around now, it would tell you about nearby restaurants and which ones are busy and which ones weren't, and which ones had good ratings and which one didn't. But without telling the restaurants, right? Without telling anyone else what it knows about you. Because people are really good at making decisions about their own lives. They're really good at figuring out what they want to do, right? So rather than paternalistically directing people and telling them you should get on this bus or you should, you know, eat at this restaurant, instead, we would tell people about all the things, and then people would make their own decisions. And the only difference between that model and the Google model is that Google doesn't get any of your data when you do it that way.
And so they don't
the
get any
difference
money.
is that it's yours, right? You exist as an autonomous person with technological self-determination, as opposed to yet another thing in the Internet of Things being sensed by the city instead of being given information by the city's sensors.
I have to hear a little bit of the Kantian moral imperative in your phrasing of treating people as sensors and not as things to be sensed. The idea that we should treat people, you know, never as mere means, but as ends in themselves. And yeah, I dig that. I think that as we're planning the smart cities of the future, that should probably be core principle number one.
The cities that would actually function. And this is sort of something I'd like to ask you about, because there's a lot of, I guess, pie in the sky stuff from Silicon Valley, and that there's a lot of like imagined like the way they describe it, it's almost like these like physical boxes that will be like actually shifting around on rails, is like through this infinite mass of humanity just processing where a coffee shop needs to be needed at every single nanosecond.
Not at all like the Matrix.
Yeah, not like the Matrix at all. But like the way they describe it is sort of this weirdly sci-fi thing. But then when it gets down to like what it actually is, it sounds less like sci-fi dystopia and more just like a giant mall that you just live in and work in and can't leave.
Yeah, or yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that is kind of the Alphabet vision, right? It's a kind of paternalistic corporate vision of the world, and people are seen as kind of normalized, idealized, quantifiable units, rather than as you say, people, the things that are a means unto themselves. I was just writing. I've got to write an essay for the LA Review of Books and about AI, and it got me rereading an essay by Molly Souter, who's a writer from Toronto, who's written really good stuff about Sidewalk Labs, called Instant Recall from 2017. And she makes this point about the intrinsic conservativeness of machine learning and of machine learning systems, of which we can think of limited liability corporations as kind of a machine learning system writ large. And really, as I said before, like they want you to be like you were, right? They want you to just keep doing the thing that they figured out how to derive value from. And they don't want you to change. And so when your own life priorities change, it messes up the system. And so by their nature, these systems are opposed to self-determination, right? It's like being in a bad marriage with someone who just wants you to be exactly the person you were when you married them 25 years ago, instead of growing into someone new and them growing with you as your life changes.
I think a lot of the opponents, kind of to wrap up here, you mentioned that opponents of the development are accused of being kind of afraid of change and against progress, and they just want to be curmudgeonly mountain trolls or whatever, and they don't want to see anything built or whatever. But it sounds like you think that we can actually have a green and progressive development and future for urban landscapes that's not corporate controlled. So how do you maybe see us attaining that someday?
Gosh, that is another good question. How do we get there? I mean, it's interesting because the crisis that we're living through, the housing crisis, the climate crisis, which they're all interrelated, that crisis is pretty widely acknowledged now, and there's still some denial around the edges, but almost everyone now agrees that these things are crises, and almost everyone agrees on like what the solution is, right? Like if you've got a problem with carbon, you need to use less carbon. And like using less carbon involves an energy transition and major changes to the housing stock and building out new transport infrastructure and so on. And fixing our cities involves things like adding a lot more housing units, making more efficient use of the housing units we have now, instituting policies that do better allocations. In Greater London, in the UK, which has a housing crisis that even puts, I think, Toronto's and Vancouver's to shame. They have more vacant bedrooms of an evening than at any time in history, because their housing stock is so badly allocated, and there's lots of reasons for it, but we kind of acknowledge what all of those things are, and our deadlock is over how we get markets to accomplish that solution, right? How do you get a market system to pay for an energy transition or rebuilding the housing stock or adding a ton more houses? And if markets can't do it, if they can't be incentivized to do it, we throw up our hands and we say, like, if markets can't do it, it must be impossible, right? Even though there's historic precedent, right? Like if we say, okay, well, the only way we're going to be able to manage a climate transition is to change our working life so that work chases excess renewable energy. So where the wind is blowing, that's where the work is done. And the workers who are in a place where the wind has stopped blowing get a holiday, right? If you say that to people, they say, well, how would you ever organize that with markets? Despite the fact that like, that's just Uber, right? That when there's demand, people work, and when there isn't, they don't. The only difference is that we wouldn't let them starve when the wind wasn't blowing. We would give them a holiday when the wind wasn't blowing. But it's exactly the mobilization that Uber managed. And so you say, okay, well, we have this thing that like markets accomplished. It's clearly possible. The idea that it's impossible just because markets can't accomplish it seems like quite a stretch. We could mobilize millions of people for World War II. We could, we've mobilized millions of people for Beatlemania, right? Like, surely we can mobilize millions of people for climate remediation, for other purposes. When there's a gold rush, we get more housing stock built than we could possibly need. When there's a bubble, we get housing stock built. When there's a housing crisis, why can't we get housing built? And I trace it back to Margaret Thatcher and her aphorism that there is no alternative, right? This idea that if markets can't do it, it's just not possible. Even if like the means are there, right? If you have a factory that is bankrupt, but the thing that it made is stuff that people want, and the workers who made it want to make the stuff, and the suppliers who supplied the raw materials want to supply the raw materials, but the factory is bankrupt and mired in whatever bankruptcy litigation or whatever. We say the factory isn't viable because the spreadsheet says it's not viable. And we never think to throw away the spreadsheet. We just throw away the factory. And, I guess my answer to like, how do we get to a just transition to a better model of urban life, to a better model of low carbon living. If it's true that markets can't do it, if we take market proponents at their word when they say that markets can't do it, then I think that it behooves us to find non-market mechanisms to do it. Right? Canada's a sovereign currency issuer. It cannot default on its debts. Canada can make as much money as it wants and spend it, and it will never default on the debt. It may create inflation, especially if it's trying to buy things that the private sector is trying to buy. But, during war times, the way that we do that is we get people to buy patriotic bonds that sequester all the money the government is spending into existence in long-term, slow-paying asset classes that prevent all that money from flooding into the actual economy and chasing the same materials that the government needs to provision itself to spare itself from this existential crisis. So, our sovereign currency issuing country can mobilize the capital that it needs and the labor it needs and the resources it needs to do anything that's for sale in the currency that it issues. And all of the things that we need to solve the climate crisis and the urban crisis are for sale in Canadian dollars. And we have an infinite supply of Canadian dollars, right? Literally, we don't even need to use a printing press to make those dollars, right? It's just typing zeros to make those dollars these days. And so given that framework, given the framework that what we have to manage is inflation, but not debt, it's not hard to think that we could weather these crises. And in fact, it becomes hard to imagine that we wouldn't, right? It becomes hard to imagine that we would opt, rather than trying this thing that we've done before in times of war and extremis, to save our species and to save our country, that we would instead throw up our hands and say, well, if the spreadsheet can't make it work, I guess we throw away the planet.
I guess we're just gonna boil alive then.
The data says we're screwed.
Oh,
so
no.
There you go. I guess that's.
Never tell me the odds.
I guess that's a good way of summing all this up. Is a question of like, what are you going to sort of obey, the statistics and data gathered by Google or the actual world?
Well, ever since we were talking about Disneyland as kind of the dark harbinger, Disney World, as kind of the dark harbinger of possible things to come at the start of the episode, I had that line from Baudrillard in mind where he says that, the rest of America requires Disney to appear normal. And all I can say right now is I would much rather live in one of your novels, Cory, where at least humans retain the ability to do the unexpected, to organize, and not just kind of be leveled down to, a hollow shells kind of along the rails of whatever the statistics say. So thanks so much for coming on. I think that our listeners will really appreciate this perspective and will be paying attention to the projects of Sidewalk Labs going forward. Anything else that you guys want to say before we sign off?
Well, I personally just find the prospect of selling a bunch of real estate of Canada's largest city to one of the world's largest American corporations to be utterly fucking dystopian and horrifying. And I can only hope that it doesn't go forward, but I'm nothing but a pessimist these days. Cory, did you have any final thoughts before we wrap up here?
Just to say that even though I haven't lived in Toronto in more than 20 years, there's a part of me that when you say Canada's largest city, I immediately just want to snark, largest and most important city. just to get the licks in. No, you're right.
Actually,
Thank you, guys.
Winnipeg is Canada's most important city. It's a rail hub, after all.
Yeah, right. So from the Cree phrase, let us leave this place and find a warmer one.
Yeah.
No, thank you, guys. No, and I don't think Toronto is the most expensive, most important city in Canada, although it might be the most expensive. And I do think that what happens to Toronto could easily happen anywhere else. So it behooves all Canadians to think about that. And I've just had a text from my wife saying that she's got the kid and they're going out for dinner and she's going to pick me up. So I got to run.
All right.
Okay,
All
Cory,
right.
Thank you so much for being on the show again. It was a pleasure as always. And if you ever want to come back on, we're the door's open.
In the city of
great.
the future, the restaurant servers could have pinged your phone, picking up live feed from your wife's phone, knowing where she's heading. No, I better not go down this
they'll
rabbit
fly
hole.
to you, Fifth Element style, to your window.
Yeah. Thanks again for coming on. It was a pleasure
Bye,
chatting
guys.
with you. All right.
Bye.
Cheers, Cory.
One of the things we were talking about the recording, and one of the things I actually liked smack dab in the middle of these dystopian hellhole videos cranked out by the various ad campaigns and satellites for Sidewalk, is this idea that there's this weird time latency between our cities and the technological gadgets and commodities in our hand, where, your iPhone is so futuristic, you've probably upgraded it 3 times in the last 10 years, but the cities around us are kind of decrepit and falling apart a lot of the time and dysfunctional more often than not. Now, your iPhone's probably dysfunctional more often than not too, but point being, I think that Cory did a really good job of driving home at some ideas for, how we actually do need to be approaching the city of the future, which is going to play an incredibly important role in everything from, cutting down on carbon emissions to future possibilities for the organization of labor, to how we think productivity, and, distributing resources to areas of need. So this is only going to become more and more relevant going forward as we see more and more attempts to privatize the public sphere in every aspect of public life and economic life. And yeah, I'm just pretty inspired right now about what the city of the future looks like. And
well, I mean, the basic notion that we need to upgrade our cities, that we could use technology to make things more integrated and make lives easier for people is true. But the fact that we'll just give the fucking key to the city over to multinational corporation A, B, or C.
Alphabet.
Alphabet.
Alpha and Omega.
That's
the beginning and the end.
That's fucking insane. That is absolutely fucking insane. So I do think it's really important not just to, on one hand, criticize Alphabet and Sidewalk Labs for their cyberpunk dystopia that they want to make a reality.
Make alphabet soup out of them.
but actually, the problem is real. But we, as people on the left, as organizers, as whatever, need to envision a better way of doing that we can actually make it democratic and inclusive and make it a reality that people actually want to live in. I think there's a Twitter handle at Block Sidewalk They recently said in a press release that they consider the updated agreement with Sidewalk Labs about all the privacy stuff as a step in the right direction, but it's a missed opportunity to finally rid ourselves of a company that is not a trustworthy partner for Toronto or any other city. So I think that really community organizations and people, community groups, do need to organize together to actually build together a city of the future that benefits people and the working class and doesn't make us all just pawns in some giant fucking Ponzi scheme of whatever corporation, be it Google or any other.
That actually leads me to one other thing that I think that I wanted to mention, which Cory mentioned a couple of times, this idea of blighted zones. And, these blighted zones pre-exist modern corporations like Google and Facebook. To a large extent, they're the zones that have just been systematically neglected by cities. Going back to the neoliberal era, we mentioned Margaret Thatcher and the creation of these kinds of sites of exclusion. But even further back, just the way that capitalist concentration of wealth and power tends to organize itself. So this is kind of preparing the grounds for these mass private takeovers, and so this thing has longer historical roots. In some ways, the cities that we live in have resisted and been complicit, and you're right that I think that organization has to be around the idea that the real blight is these like neo-feudalistic corporate overlords who want to come in and take over and domineer even more forcefully with modern technology at their hands. That's the boil that you've got to burst to get off your back. That's the pustule. The parasite.
I mean, it's the problem, I guess I would say, with Sidewalk Labs, and it's the part that that a lot of Google and a lot of these tech companies never really resolve themselves in, is that they imagine a world in which all of this will just be astoundingly and stupidly profitable for everyone. Like, everyone will want to live in our, Delta City of the future because everyone will be paid well and it'll be great, and the buses will show up on time because you pressed a button on your phone to tell the bus driver to do that, or it's automated or whatever. But the problem, I guess, is that, like, consistently with these companies, their profit margins are in reality no different than anyone else's, and they're looking at the exact same kind of like cruel cost-cutting measures that everyone else is looking at. And so it ends up being less like living in like the utopian world of the future and more like living in like a McDonald's where, buzzers are ringing all the time and there's things you're supposed to be doing and shit has to happen because there's just this infrastructure that's just telling you, like, there's a computer based on profitability determining what the metrics are for your behavior. And the problem is that profitability is inevitably going to get kind of narrow and cruel, so that, like, today you might be paid a decent wage to live in the city of the future. But if the metric says tomorrow that actually we have way too many, people in our city of the future, then yeah, their lives become less valuable and therefore cheaper and worse.
And that points to an even more bizarre and kind of simple economic reason for why I think this version of the city of the future is completely unsustainable. And it's that their notion of productivity is kind of centered around not the producer, but the consumer. So they are data mines, essentially. And all of their points of data come from advertising preferences. So it's entirely organized around the individual's capacity to consume rather than produce, and the things that they're consuming have to come from somewhere. So there's always this like presumptive influx of goods.
No. We don't need to make anything. It's an information economy.
Exactly, right? So like, how does that stay afloat?
I actually think that would be a pretty interesting sci-fi concept. The idea that there's like a closed-off, hived city whose entire purpose is simply to provide data mining for advertising to the rest of the world.
This is where we make our Bitcoin.
Like the Toronto utopian bubble is just going to exist and probably will exist, not for the purpose of improving those people's lives, but providing useful, sellable metrics to the rest of the world. So it's like, okay, here's what our Google, Apple, Alphabet, whatever, we've determined based on our statistics what like an effective road management system would be for traffic. We will sell you that data as a subscription service for such and such amount of money to your crappy normal city. And I think that's the only way that this dumb scheme could actually be profitable, is basically just using these people as lab rats and having them run around, chasing after trying to make money.
Profitable, or that they would just own a huge swath of Toronto, for fuck's sake. I mean,
that's
it's gonna
true
be
too.
Profitable.
But to be fair, like, the housing bubble will eventually collapse. There isn't really like. I mean, the problem with Google, I guess, in this case is like what they're like. If you're not going to do anything productive on that land, the land is not very valuable at the end of the day. It's entirely speculative. It doesn't matter. Like, to be fair, they could build this stupid fucking city out in the middle, like in the Arctic Circle, for all it matters.
In fact, northern Saskatchewan was one of the places that they had.
Do that. I can tell you why they wouldn't do that,
because it's fucking cold.
These Silicon Valley
just do an internal enclosure.
Don't like the idea of living in a place that is either, too isolated from civilization and not civilized enough as far as they're concerned. They want to have coffee shops to be able to go to, and to have the like in the idea of the planned city of tomorrow would be like, yes, you could plunk this thing down anywhere, but the actual reality is they want to know that there's a sewer system there, a power grid that exists that they don't have to build or pay for, and a road network that they can like link into that they also don't have to build or pay for.
And it's just too cold for them.
Yeah, well,
to be fair, they are from California.
And also, northern Saskatchewan is fucking cold.
Well, there's a question there too of like risk and exposure, right? And risk and liability.
Exposure, I like that in both senses.
Yeah, that. But risk and liability, more accurately put, because the people living in this city are inevitably going to be exposed to all kinds of risks, and the company is ultimately not going to be held liable for any kind of failures in this lab experiment. If things go awry and their stock value goes tits up, then a bunch of people are going to lose their houses. It's not going to be Sidewalk Labs that's individually held accountable, especially lacking any kind of real democratic oversight or regulatory restraints on this thing.
Well, that's the most terrifying part about giving a giant fuck off swath of Toronto to a private company, is this lack of oversight. Oh, we've conducted an internal investigation and have found ourselves not guilty of any wrongdoing.
Yeah, it'll be like the robots in New Vegas. They'll just shoot anyone who tries to get in, and if you get in, great. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a terrifying precedent to set. In fact, I was up a little late last night. I had I think I had a whole bottle of wine and was listening to like 4 or 5 episodes of the Sidewalk Labs podcast, which you can find on YouTube.
Friend of the show.
And I'm a friend of the show, and I felt like I had been whisked away into some fever dream of Elon Musk, where it was just the most absurd like techno-libertarian fever dream shit. Like, oh, the buildings will just be fluid and be modular and change all the time, and we'll have these automated self-driving cars that will do underground waste management for us. And it's like if you had a fucking 9-year-old like draw their dream techno
That's
city,
how I did
that
it.
was it.
Did the windows in your dream shatter too?
They did not. But I mean, I just was, I felt because I know that some people would listen to this shit and be like, whoa, wow, that's amazing. That's the city of the future. Because they actually fucking trust Google for some fucking reason. But I mean, for me, it was just like, wow, this is a fucking nightmare. Like, this is an actual, like, techno fucking cyberpunk dystopia come to life.
Well, let's talk about the limits of this modularity and like what on the other side of that coin isn't allowed to be fluid or organized at all, which is organized labor. And just in the news this week, or like Google laid off 4 employees for trying to unionize. So there's always that kind of flip side to the fluidity of this city of the future, which is that it requires that certain assets aren't fluid, that they stay fixed, which is traditionally, the commodity gets to be fluid and transcend all boundaries, and the worker, labor, has to stay in place. That's how borders under capitalism and capitalist imperialism always kind of function. And so, what the city is trying to do is render more and more top levels of abstraction, more and more that can become part of the commodity sphere. But at a certain point, there's always going to be some raw material resource that has to stay fixed in place. And that's going to be, the bodies of people rendered homeless, the lands of indigenous people unsettled by even further back historical relations in these cities. It's going to be people displaced by just dips in stock values of the companies. It's going to be, whatever.
Rent goes up and wages go down and people are rendered homeless. And that can happen in a smart city as much as anywhere else.
Yeah.
We could, all we really need to introduce is like the aperture science panels, and then we can just have our city be built in whichever way we want. But
only if we got portal guns too.
Well, yeah, but that's all the problem. It's all just bullshit. It's all bullshit. It's all just like, what if we were to just, the obvious answer is like, yeah, what if we were to have housing available for people on the basis of need? Yeah, what a concept. And then this whole like nonsensical market mechanism has to like insert itself between us and our needs. And we have to negotiate our way to our fulfilling our needs through the market. And that's apparently the only thing that we're allowed to do, especially in these smart cities. But it all starts off with like, what if the bus were to come on time whenever you needed it? Or what if a car was there whenever you needed it? Or, coffee was made fresh just as you walked into the coffee shop. It's like, yeah, that would be neat. But that's all based on need and not on profit. And as soon as you insert profit into that, it buggers up the whole system.
I do kind of think that this whole Sidewalk Labs thing could kind of be brought into Naomi Klein's disaster capitalism a little bit, just to kind of, wrap up and change the subject a little bit, because, you have this housing crisis in Toronto, you have a homelessness crisis, there are empty units that aren't being utilized, it's super fucking not affordable and expensive. Well, just let Google, own this massive swath of the city, and they'll just fix it, and they'll build the beautiful city of the future. They'll fix all of our problems. But at the core, the reason that we have a housing crisis in Toronto and Vancouver and Victoria and elsewhere, many other cities across the world are having exactly the same problem, is because housing is privately owned and land is privately owned, and it's done to the profit motive. And so giving the city over to a massive multinational corporation that, as it turns out, is also motivated by this very same profit motive isn't going to fix anything. But it's kind of an opportunistic swipe at, Google looked at many locations across the world to propose their first smart city Sidewalk Labs thing, and they chose Toronto ostensibly because it was a very culturally diverse.
The land was cheap. The city government was easily corrupted.
Well, it's a mine for diversity. It is one of, if not the most diverse cities in the world.
Well, definitely North America.
And so it generates you a lot of valuable data points from that perspective.
Yeah. So
and all that they know how to do is to consume. They don't know how to produce. All that Google does is incorporate.
Well, thank you for tuning in, everyone. We really appreciate it. I want to give an extra massive big ups shout out to our new patron subscribers who are financially contributing to the show. We really appreciate it. We will send your swag in the mail shortly. If any of you listeners do want to buy us a beer, contribute to the podcast, we always appreciate it. Even a $1 a month on Patreon is fucking rad. Please do follow us on Twitter @RealUlf. Like our Facebook page. Apparently, leaving a positive review on iTunes is an extremely effective way to help out the show. I'm not an Apple guy, so I didn't really know this. But if any of you listeners want to take a minute or two to give us some big ups on iTunes, that would be fucking rad. Also, just want to remind everyone that Out of Left Field podcast is part of a broader, wonderful family of similarly minded left-wing political podcasts based in Canada on the Ricochet Podcast Network. You can find their website at ricochet.media, and you have other similar shows such as Rob Rousseau's 49th Parahell, Andrew Goulet's Unpacking the News, The Alberta Advantage, Kino Lefter, movie review podcasts, and others. So please do be sure to check out those other shows. And thank you to everyone who supports the show and listeners. Every single one of you listening to this right now, I fucking love you. You're rad. Again, thank you very much to Cory Doctorow for being on the podcast, one of our favorite guests. Happy holidays to everyone, and we will see you next time.